On a serene afternoon in Fort Collins, Colorado, the park was alive with the joyful sounds of children laughing, joggers pacing along the trail, and families enjoying picnics beneath the shade of towering oak trees. In the midst of this peaceful scene sat Camille, a well-respected attorney, her attention absorbed in the pages of a thick hardcover book. The world around her seemed to slow down, but that tranquility was shattered in an instant. A sharp screech of tires pierced the calm, and a police cruiser abruptly pulled up to the curb, drawing the attention of a few nearby onlookers. Two officers, stern-faced and exuding authority, stepped out. They locked eyes on Camille, the only person sitting alone in the vicinity. They approached, their steps deliberate. "Ma'am, may we speak with you for a moment?" One officer called out, his tone carrying suspicion more than concern. Camille looked up, her demeanor unshaken. "Of course," she replied, closing her book gently, her calmness a stark contrast to the tension building around her. But the officers weren't satisfied. They insisted on seeing her ID, a request that seemed increasingly bizarre to Camille. Suspicious activity? She thought, her mind racing. She had done nothing more than sit in a public park, enjoying a rare moment of peace as she handed over her driver's license. The officer's scrutiny only deepened. "What's your business here, Miss Johnson?" one of them asked, as if her very presence was a crime. Camille's pulse quickened, but she remained composed. "I live in this city. I came here to enjoy the park. Is that a problem?" But it wasn't just routine questioning anymore. The officers continued pressing her, each question designed to escalate the tension. And before Camille could fully process what was happening, one of the officers reached out and grabbed her arm. "You're resisting," he declared. Despite standing still, Camille felt the cold metal of handcuffs snap onto her wrists, a crushing sense of disbelief washing over her. What had started as a quiet moment of reading had now spiraled into an arrest as she was led toward the police cruiser. Her heart raced, and the murmurs of the growing crowd filled her ears. Camille's world had shifted in an instant, from a peaceful moment to the harsh reality of unjust treatment. Little did the officers know, this was just the beginning of a story that would change everything. The police cruiser's engine hummed as it pulled away from the park, the tires squealing against the asphalt. Camille sat in the back seat, her hands cuffed tightly behind her, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't shake the feeling that everything was happening so fast, yet so slowly. She had been reading a book, completely unaware that her quiet afternoon would be interrupted by this chaotic turn of events. The world outside the cruiser blurred by in a haze, as though she were watching a movie, unable to break free from the script. How had this become her reality? She tried to breathe deeply, to steady herself, but her mind raced. It wasn't just the shock of being arrested, it was the indignity of it, the injustice. She was a lawyer. She knew her rights. She knew the law inside and out. Yet here she was, a respected professional, handcuffed and treated like a criminal. The absurdity of it gnawed at her, deepening the sense of helplessness. Was she really just a victim of prejudice? A woman, a black woman, treated this way in broad daylight, in a public space. The ride to the station felt suffocating. The oppressive silence inside the car made it feel as though the walls were closing in. The officers didn't speak to her. They didn't need to. They were indifferent. It wasn't about getting to know her or understanding her side. It was about power. It was about asserting control over her in a way that only further reinforced their authority. Their cold, unfeeling silence was the true punishment. When they arrived at the station, the harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in a sterile, cold light. Camille was led through the hallways like a criminal, her wrist aching from the handcuffs that had yet to be removed. The booking process was invasive, humiliating, and unnecessarily drawn out. Every step seemed designed to strip her of her dignity. She was fingerprinted, photographed, and processed like a criminal, though she had done nothing wrong. The officers who had arrested her moved around her with a sense of superiority, their smugness apparent in the way they spoke to her and to each other. One officer, who had seemed particularly eager to assert his power over her, mocked her as he shut the door to the small holding cell. "Enjoy your stay," he sneered, the door slamming shut with a finality that echoed in her ears. Camille stood there, her mind whirling. How had this happened? She had done nothing but sit in a park, reading her book. Her calmness had been mistaken for compliance, her silence for guilt. Hours passed, though it felt like a lifetime. No one acknowledged her, no one checked on her. She was left alone in that cold, lonely cell, her thoughts a whirlwind of anger, confusion, and disbelief. All she wanted was to go home, to put this nightmare behind her, but it felt like the nightmare was only beginning. She replayed every moment in the park over and over again in her head, trying to make sense of it. How had two police officers, people she had never met before, treated her this way? Why was she being punished for something that wasn't even a crime? It wasn't until hours later that a young officer came to her cell, holding a clipboard. His face was expressionless, flat. "Miss Johnson," he began, his voice neutral, "you've been charged with resisting arrest and obstructing a peace officer." Camille didn't flinch. The words were just that, words. They didn't make sense. She hadn't resisted. She hadn't obstructed anything. She had merely refused to answer questions when the officers couldn't provide a valid reason for their interrogation. What grounds? Camille's voice was sharp now, sharper than she intended. She wasn't going to let this slide. "You can discuss that in court," the officer said flatly, turning away without another word. Camille exhaled slowly, the weight of the situation settling heavily on her shoulders. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about something bigger. It was about standing up for herself, but also standing up for everyone who had ever been wronged by a system that was supposed to protect them. She had been humiliated, stripped of her dignity, but that humiliation wasn't going to define her. No, she would turn this around. She would fight back. The thought of what lay ahead made her stomach tighten, but the determination was rising in her, steady and unwavering. She would not let this go. This fight wasn't just for her. It was for anyone who had ever been dismissed, disrespected, or mistreated simply because of who they were. Camille had spent years standing up for others in courtrooms, fighting for justice in a system that too often failed to deliver it. Now, the injustice wasn't just something she was witnessing from the sidelines. It was something she was living through, something she was going to change. When Camille was finally released on bail, the cold night air outside the station hit her like a shock to the system, a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere she had just left behind. Her friend, Marissa, was waiting for her by the curb, her face a mixture of relief and concern. "Are you okay?" Marissa asked, rushing over to her. Camille nodded, but the tremor in her hands betrayed her. "I'm fine," she said, but the words felt hollow. She wasn't fine. Not wide as they drove away. The silence between them stretched, thick and heavy. Finally, Camille broke it, her voice low but firm. "I'm not letting this slide, Marissa. Not this time." Marissa's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking I'm tired of this happening," Camille replied. "I have the tools, the knowledge, and the resources to fight back. And I will." She could feel the fire inside her now. The injustice had been done, but it wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. And no matter what, Camille would make sure the world knew her story. The days following Camille's release were filled with a blur of emotions. Her heart still raced at the thought of her arrest, the humiliation, the fear, but beneath it all, a fierce resolve began to grow. She wasn't just going to let this go. No, this was bigger than her. This was about something much larger, about standing up against a system that had wronged her and so many others. Camille threw herself into her work. She gathered evidence, spoke with colleagues, and reached out to the people who had supported her since the video of her arrest went viral. She was going to file a lawsuit against the officers. But as the days stretched on, the world seemed to slow down. Camille felt like she was teetering on the edge of something huge, something she couldn't fully comprehend. Her life had been turned upside down in one afternoon, and now she was preparing to take on the very system she had spent years fighting within one afternoon. As Camille sat in her office, poring over case files, her phone rang. It was her attorney. She didn't recognize the number, but the urgency in the way he spoke immediately put her on alert. "Camille, I need you to sit down for this." Her stomach clenched as she did just that. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice steady despite the sudden rush of anxiety. "You're not going to believe this," he said. "You've been assigned as the judge for one of the cases involving the 2 officers who arrested you." The words didn't make sense. She felt as though the floor had dropped out from beneath her. It was one thing to be caught in a courtroom, fighting for justice, but to be placed in this position, this role, was something she couldn't have predicted. She had spent days preparing for a civil rights lawsuit against these officers, but now fate had put her in a seat where she was in charge. "Are you sure?" Camille's voice trembled despite her best efforts to keep it even. "I'm positive," her attorney replied. "It's a case involving misconduct. 2 officers accused of excessive force in an unrelated incident. And now you're the judge." She could feel the blood drain from her face. She wasn't sure if this was a cruel joke, or if it was something deeper, something more poetic in its irony. She was the judge. She was going to be the one to decide their fate. But how could she sit in judgment of the same officers who had humiliated and abused her? How could she maintain impartiality, knowing what they had done to her? The weight of the situation was too much to bear. She wasn't prepared for this. She wasn't ready for this turn of events. Still, Camille knew there was no way out. She couldn't back down. This was her chance to show the world what real justice looked like. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about retribution. It was about accountability. It was about making sure that no one else would ever have to suffer the way she had. As the day of the trial approached, Camille found herself filled with doubt. She had spent years working within the legal system, but now she was on the other side of it, facing the officers who had arrested her. She spent sleepless nights questioning herself, wondering if she could be the impartial judge that the courtroom needed. Could she put aside her personal feelings, her anger, and her pain to deliver a fair judgment? The morning of the trial, Camille walked into the courthouse with a heavy heart. The atmosphere in the courtroom was different today. It wasn't just another routine case. The air was thick with tension. Camille's arrival did not go unnoticed. The buzz in the room grew louder as people filed in, their whispers sharp with curiosity. And then, as she stepped onto the bench, she saw them. Officers Carter and Daniels. The same men who had arrested her, the same men who had treated her like a criminal in front of a crowd of strangers. Their faces went pale as they locked eyes with her. They were sitting at the defendant's table, trying to maintain an air of indifference, but Camille could see it in their eyes. The shock, the recognition. They knew who she was now. They knew who had the power. The irony of it hit her hard. Here they were, the officers who had once held the power to strip her of her dignity, now sitting before her, vulnerable. For a moment, Camille allowed herself to feel the weight of it. She had the upper hand now. But that wasn't why she was here. She wasn't here for revenge. She was here to show the world that justice had to be more than a set of rules. It had to be about fairness, accountability, and above all, the courage to stand up for what was right. Even when it wasn't easy, she called the court to order, her voice firm and steady. "This court is now in session," she announced. The room fell silent as the proceedings began. Camille's eyes kept flicking to the 2 officers. She could see the discomfort in their posture, the way they fidgeted in their seats. They were nervous. She could feel the tension in the room, their unease, her own emotions boiling beneath the surface. But she pushed it all aside. She had a job to do. As the attorneys began to make their cases, Camille listened intently. Every word, every argument felt loaded. She could hear the defense trying to justify the officers' actions, trying to explain away their excessive use of force. But Camille wasn't buying it. She had lived through this. She had seen firsthand what abuse of power looked like. The truth was clear. These men had failed to uphold the very laws they swore to protect. But it wasn't just about them. It was about the system. It was about making sure that the scales of justice didn't tip in favor of those who abused their power, that the law applied equally to everyone, no matter who they were or what their uniform said. As the trial wore on, Camille's resolve only grew stronger. The more she heard, the more determined she became. The irony of the situation was not lost on her. but the weight of the responsibility she now carried was more than just a cruel twist of fate. It was an opportunity to change the course of her life and the lives of countless others who had been wronged. And as the court session came to a close that day, Camille realized that this was only the beginning. The officers were not the only ones on trial. The entire system was being tested. The stakes had never been higher. The courtroom was a battlefield, but this time Camille was the one holding the gavel. The weight of it, the responsibility of it, settled heavily on her shoulders as she took her seat at the bench. The room, filled with onlookers and legal professionals, was quieter than usual, an undercurrent of tension vibrating through the air. Camille felt every gaze upon her, every whisper that passed between the rows of seats. But she didn't let it break her. She had no choice but to remain composed. To command the room, her eyes flickered to the two defendants seated at the table, Officers Carter and Daniels. They sat stiffly, their faces betraying the anxiety they tried so desperately to hide. Their eyes avoided hers, but Camille could feel their discomfort, their uncertainty. This wasn't a routine case for them. They had been on the other side of the law, wielding their power over innocent civilians. And now, they were the ones being judged. Camille knew this wasn't going to be easy. She had spent years in courtrooms, fighting for justice, but today was different. Today, she was the judge, and the officers who had arrested her were the ones standing trial. She had to fight her own personal emotions, suppress the anger that simmered beneath her calm exterior. She wasn't here for revenge. She wasn't here to make them pay for what they did to her. She was here to ensure that justice, real justice, was done. The trial began with the prosecutor presenting the case against the officers. His voice was steady, filled with authority. "Ladies and gentlemen of the court," he began, "we are here today to examine the actions of Officers Carter and Daniels, who, on the night in question, used excessive force on a civilian. The victim, Mr. Ethan, was unarmed, compliant, and posed no threat. The officers, however, decided to escalate the situation, using force that was unnecessary and unjustified." Camille listened intently as the prosecutor laid out the evidence. She saw the photos of the bruises and cuts that Ethan had sustained. She heard the testimony of witnesses who had been present during the incident. And as the prosecutor spoke, she felt the growing weight of the truth. The officers had not only violated the law, they had violated their oaths, their duty to protect and serve. When the prosecutor finished, Camille turned her attention to the defense. Officer Carter's lawyer stood up, adjusting his suit, trying to project confidence as he began his defense. "Your Honor," he started, his voice smooth but strained, "while we acknowledge that there was force used that night, we believe it was in response to a rapidly escalating situation. The officers felt threatened, and their actions, though unfortunate, were necessary to regain control of the situation." Camille's eyes narrowed as the lawyer continued to speak. She knew what he was trying to do. He was trying to shift the blame, to paint the officers as victims of a situation that had spiraled out of control. But Camille wasn't buying it. She had seen it all before. Officers justifying their actions, minimizing the harm they caused, and refusing to take responsibility. The defense lawyer continued, his arguments growing more desperate, but Camille's mind was elsewhere. She knew what she had to do. She had to remain impartial, to weigh the facts, to look at the evidence, and let that guide her decision. But inside, her emotions were a whirlwind. She could feel the officers' gaze on her, their discomfort palpable, but she refused to let their unease cloud her judgment. They had to be held accountable. There was no other option. The court recessed for a break, and as the room emptied, Camille stayed seated at the bench, her hands clenched tightly in front of her. She stared at the papers in front of her, her mind racing. She couldn't let them get away with this. She couldn't let their actions go unpunished. But she had to be careful. She had to make sure her decision was based on the facts, not her personal feelings. When the court reconvened, Camille could feel the eyes of the room on her once more. She called the first witness to the stand, Ethan, the young man who had been assaulted by the officers. He was nervous, his hands trembling as he took the oath. But when he began to speak, his voice steadied. "I was just trying to comply," Ethan said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I didn't resist. I was scared, but I did everything they asked. They never gave me a chance to explain. They just threw me to the ground." The room was silent as Ethan spoke, his words heavy with pain. Camille's heart ached for him. She could see the trauma in his eyes, the fear that still haunted him. And as he continued to recount the events of that night, the tension in the courtroom grew thicker. The officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their expressions tight with unease. The defense lawyer attempted to undermine Ethan's testimony, but Camille was listening closely. She could hear the truth in Ethan's voice. His story didn't add up with the officers' version of events. The officers had acted recklessly, and now they were trying to cover their tracks. Finally, the officers were called to testify. Officer Carter was the first to take the stand. He was visibly nervous, his hands shaking as he swore to tell the truth. His voice wavered as he began his testimony, and Camille could see the cracks forming in his composure. "Officer Carter," the prosecutor began, his voice calm but firm, "you're being accused of using excessive force on an unarmed, compliant individual. How do you justify your actions that night?" Carter hesitated, his eyes darting to the defense lawyer for reassurance before answering. I thought the situation was escalating," he said. "I made a judgment call. I thought it was necessary to restrain him." Camille's eyes narrowed. "And do you believe your actions were justified?" she asked, her voice steady but full of authority. "At the time, yes," Carter replied, his voice growing weaker. "But looking back, I could have handled it differently." For the first time, Camille saw something in Carter's eyes: regret. It was fleeting, but it was there. He knew what he had done, and he was starting to realize the weight of it. Officer Daniels took the stand next, his testimony just as shaky, his excuses just as hollow. Camille could see the officers unraveling before her eyes. They had built their careers on a system of power, but now that system was breaking down. They were facing the consequences of their actions, and for the first time, they seemed to understand the gravity of what they had done as the trial continued. Camille's resolve only grew stronger. She had the power to make a difference. The officer's fate was in her hands, and she would not let this opportunity slip away. The room was filled with tension, every word, every gesture charged with significance. This wasn't just about two officers. This was about accountability. This was about ensuring that no one, no matter who they were, was above the law. And when the closing arguments were made, Camille knew exactly what she had to do. She would not let these officers get away with their actions. Not this time. Not ever again. The courtroom was heavy with anticipation as Camille took her seat at the bench, her gaze fixed on the officers in front of her. The room, once filled with murmurs and whispered opinions, had fallen into a tense silence. The final moments of the trial had arrived, and now the weight of it all rested solely on her shoulders. She had listened to the testimonies, analyzed the evidence, and wrestled with her own emotions. But the time had come for her to make her decision. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the gavel to fall. Camille's heart raced, her fingers tightening around the gavel. This wasn't just any case. It was her case. The officers who had once held the power to strip her of her dignity, to humiliate her in front of a crowd, were now before her, vulnerable and exposed. They had tried to justify their actions, shifting blame and minimizing their mistakes. But Camille saw through it all. She had seen firsthand what abuse of power looked like, and she knew that justice wasn't just about the law, it was about doing what was right. The prosecutor's closing remarks had been clear and decisive, outlining the officers' reckless use of force and their blatant disregard for the very laws they had sworn to uphold. The defense, on the other hand, had faltered. Their arguments were weak, their justifications flimsy. Officer Carter had admitted that, in hindsight, he could have handled the situation differently, but Camille knew that wasn't enough. There was no room for what-ifs in a courtroom. The officers had made a choice that night, and that choice had consequences. Camille inhaled deeply, her gaze sweeping across the courtroom. She could feel the weight of the moment, the eyes of the world on her. This wasn't just about two officers, it was about sending a message. It was about standing up to a system that had allowed injustice to thrive. She had been humiliated, stripped of her rights, and subjected to a system that often failed to hold those in power accountable. But this time it was different. This time, she had the power. After careful consideration of all the evidence presented in this case, Camille began, her voice steady but firm. I find the defendants, Officers Carter and Daniels, guilty of using excessive force and violating the civil rights of Mr. Ethan. The words hung in the air, a moment of finality that sent a ripple through the room. The officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their faces pale. They had known the moment they stepped into this courtroom that they were facing the consequences of their actions. But hearing the words from Camille herself seemed to hit them with an even greater force. Their bravado had melted away, replaced by a quiet understanding that the system they had once trusted to protect them had, in this moment, turned against them. Camille continued, her voice unwavering. These actions were not only unjustified, they were a blatant abuse of power. The officers' conduct violated the trust placed in them by the community. They failed in their duty to protect and serve. The consequences of their actions are not just a matter of legal punishment. They are a matter of integrity, accountability, and the rule of law. The tension in the room seemed to build with each word she spoke. This was the moment. The officers had been found guilty. But now came the hard part, the consequences. What would Camille decide? What would justice look like in this case? Therefore, Camille continued, Officer Carter and Officer Daniels will face a mandatory suspension without pay for a period of 6 months. They will also be required to attend extensive retraining on the appropriate use of force and community relations. Additionally, both officers will have formal disciplinary records that will follow them throughout their careers. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, a mix of relief and disbelief. Camille's decision wasn't just a slap on the wrist. It was a clear message that actions had consequences. No one, not even those who wore the badge, were above the law. The officers sat frozen, their expressions a mixture of frustration, regret, and the dawning realization that their actions had cost them far more than just a few months without pay. But that is not all, Camille added, her voice cutting through the tension. This case will also serve as a precedent for future cases. It is my hope that this ruling will send a message to every officer, to every member of the community, that abuse of power will not be tolerated. The law is not a shield for those in positions of authority. It is a tool for justice. And justice demands accountability. The gavel came down with a sharp crack, echoing through the room. This court is adjourned. As the officers left the courtroom, their heads bowed, Camille remained seated at the bench, her hands trembling ever so slightly. It was over. She had delivered her verdict. But it wasn't just about these two officers, it was about something much larger. It was about a system that had failed for too long. And now, perhaps, it was beginning to change as the room slowly emptied. Camille could feel the weight of the moment settle over her. She had done what she had set out to do. She had held the officers accountable, yes, but she had also done something more. She had set a precedent for others who had been wronged, for those who felt powerless, for those who had been silenced. The trial had been long, painful, and emotionally exhausting, but Camille had proven something to herself, to the officers, and to everyone watching. Justice wasn't just a concept, it was a practice. It was something you fought for, something you held on to even when it seemed impossible. As Camille left the courthouse that day, a quiet sense of pride washed over her. She had stood tall, not just as a judge, but as a woman who had fought for what was right. The journey was far from over, but this was a step in the right direction. The courtroom doors closed behind Camille with a finality that seemed to echo in the stillness. But as she stood there, her gavel now resting quietly in front of her, the true impact of the decision she had just made began to sink in. She had not just ruled on a case. She had ignited a spark, one that was bound to catch fire in the hearts and minds of those who had been watching. Outside the courthouse, the air was thick with anticipation. Word of the verdict had already spread like wildfire, carried through social media, news outlets, and the whispers of those who had been in the room. Camille knew that this was not just a legal victory. It was a cultural one, a powerful moment in a battle that had been raging for far too long. It was a statement to everyone who had ever been wronged, mistreated, or silenced by the systems meant to protect them. Justice was possible. Change was possible. But the weight of the moment was not lost on Camille. As she left the courthouse, she felt the eyes of the world on her. People crowded around her, some offering congratulations, others seeking her out for interviews, their words filled with admiration. Camille smiled politely but kept her composure. She knew what they wanted: answers, reassurance, a symbol of hope. And in that moment, she realized that she had become that symbol. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the many others who had suffered in silence, the ones who had been denied justice, who had never had the courage to speak out. The community rallied around Camille, offering their support, their thanks, their stories of injustice. As she sat in her office, sorting through the flood of emails and messages, she felt both humbled and overwhelmed. Some were simple thank you notes, while others were deeply personal accounts of lives shattered by the very people sworn to protect them. Camille knew that her ruling had struck a chord, but she had no idea just how deeply it had resonated. Point one message, in particular, stood out. It was from a woman named Sarah, who had been the victim of police brutality years ago. She had never spoken out, never filed a complaint, too afraid of retaliation and the lack of support. But when she saw Camille take a stand, when she saw her face the very officers who had wronged her, Sarah felt a shift in her. For the first time in years, she believed that justice could be achieved, that her pain wasn't forgotten. "You gave me back my voice," Sarah wrote. "Thank you for standing up, not just for yourself, but for all of us." Camille sat there, staring at the message, her eyes burning with emotion. She had always fought for justice, but this was different. This wasn't just a victory in court. It was a movement, a call to action, a reminder that no one was alone in their fight. But even as the flood of gratitude poured in, there was an undeniable pressure building around her. The media storm was relentless. Reporters lined up outside her office, desperate for an interview, for a quote, for a soundbite. Camille knew that the attention on her was only going to intensify. This wasn't just about two officers anymore. This was about exposing the deep cracks in the system that allowed such abuse to persist. The case had sparked a conversation, but now it was time to take it further. With every interview, every public appearance, Camille's resolve grew stronger. She wasn't just talking about accountability. She was living it. She was standing at the forefront of a conversation that needed to happen, one that demanded uncomfortable truths and real change. The officers who had arrested her were not the only ones being held accountable. The entire system was on trial, and Camille was determined to ensure that those who had been wronged didn't remain invisible. But there was a deep, quiet part of Camille that worried. What would the consequences be for her, for those who stood with her? The backlash, the resistance from those who would rather sweep the problem under the rug, had already begun to stir. Some had applauded her bravery, but others had questioned her impartiality. The whispers of doubt, of people eager to tear down what she had built, were never far away. The system wasn't going to change overnight. Camille knew that. But with each step forward, with each person who reached out to share their story, she saw the beginning of something larger than herself. She had set the wheels of change in motion. And while the road ahead would undoubtedly be long and fraught with obstacles, Camille felt an unshakable sense of purpose. She wasn't just a symbol of justice, she was a catalyst for it. And then, there was the next step, the next challenge. The case had set a precedent, yes, but what about the countless other victims? What about the men and women who had been abused, mistreated, and ignored for far too long? Camille knew that the real work was just beginning. It wasn't enough to change one case, to expose one injustice. She needed to be a part of something bigger, a movement that could no longer be silenced. As Camille stood on the steps of the courthouse, watching a group of young activists gather for a peaceful rally, she felt a renewed sense of hope. The fight for justice was far from over, but it was no longer a lonely one. With every voice that joined the cause, with every person who stood up and demanded change, Camille knew that this was the beginning of something powerful. And she would be right there, fighting alongside them, for as long as it took. The journey was just beginning. But for the first time in a long while, Camille believed that change was not just possible. It was inevitable. The courtroom had been just one chapter in Camille's journey toward justice. The verdict was delivered, but the true work was only beginning. She knew that what she had accomplished, holding the officers accountable, sending a message about the importance of integrity and accountability, was a necessary step. But Camille understood the larger picture. This was about more than one case. This was about changing a system that had been broken for far too long. This was about empowering people to believe that their voices mattered, that their stories were worth telling, and that no one, no matter their position of power, was above the LAW. As the weeks passed, Camille's resolve only deepened. The media attention had been intense at first, but it had begun to settle. She had done her interviews, spoken at public forums, and met with activists who were fighting the same battles. The spotlight on her didn't wane, but it gave her something far more powerful, a platform. And with that platform, Camille had a chance to elevate others who had been silenced, whose experiences had been ignored or dismissed by a system designed to protect those in power. In those early days after the trial, Camille had taken the time to sit with herself, to reflect on everything that had led up to this moment. She thought about her experience in the park, about the overwhelming injustice she had faced, and about the sheer frustration of knowing that the system she had once believed in could be so flawed. Yet, it was that very same system that had also given her the tools to challenge the status quo. The law could be an instrument of oppression, but it could also be an instrument of change. Camille used her platform to call for continued reform, to advocate for stronger accountability measures, and to encourage others to get involved. She worked with organizations, activists, and community leaders to push for real, lasting change. But her focus remained the same: to create a future where people were treated equally under the law, where no one was above justice, and where the voices of the oppressed were heard, respected, and acted upon. One of the most powerful lessons that Camille learned through this experience was the importance of staying true to one's values, even in the face of adversity. It would have been easy to let the fear, the criticism, and the pressure from those who didn't want change silence her. But Camille had discovered that justice was never a passive pursuit. It required action. It required stepping up, speaking out, and never backing down. "I was just doing my job," Camille told a room full of young law students one afternoon, her voice steady with conviction. But sometimes, doing your job means taking a stand. It means using the knowledge you've gained, the platform you've built, and the influence you have to make sure that the system works for everyone, not just those at the top. You have to fight for fairness, for equality, for dignity. That's the job. She could feel the weight of those words as she said them. The future lawyers in the room hung on every sentence. This was her call to action, to the next generation of advocates, to those who would one day sit where she had sat, wielding the power to make a difference. Camille knew that this was how change would continue, not just through one person's actions, but through a collective effort. It was a call to everyone to engage in the fight for justice, to stay vigilant, to never forget that every single voice mattered. The conversation Camille had started in the courtroom had spread far beyond the walls of that building. It had become part of a broader movement, a movement that was slowly but surely gaining momentum. People were talking, people were listening, people were demanding change, and that was the most encouraging part of it all. But Camille knew the fight was ongoing. There was still so much work to be done. Laws could be changed, policies could be reformed, but true transformation required a shift in mindset. It required a commitment from every person who believed in equality, fairness, and justice, to take an active role in building a better future. No matter how big or small the action, it mattered. Change doesn't happen in an instant, Camille often reminded her colleagues and friends. It's a process, but with persistence, with courage, and with a collective will to fight for what's right, we can make that change inevitable. It was that message of hope, that belief in the possibility of a better world, that Camille carried with her everywhere she went. It wasn't about individual victories. It was about the broader fight for justice, for fairness, and for the dignity of every person. And every day, Camille took a small step toward that goal. For those who had been following her journey, for those who had been inspired by her courage and determination, the lesson was clear. Don't wait for change to come to you. Be the change. Take action however you can and stand firm in your conviction. Change starts with individuals, but it grows into something much larger when people come together. As Camille looked out over the crowd at a recent rally, she saw faces, young and old, filled with hope and determination. People who had once been afraid to speak out were now raising their voices in unison, demanding justice. It was a beautiful sight, and it was only just the beginning. The ongoing fight for justice would never be easy, but as Camille had learned, it was always worth it. And to everyone watching, to everyone inspired by this story, Camille left a final thought. If you believe in fairness, if you believe in the power of justice, if you believe in a world where everyone is treated equally, then stand with us. Join the fight, because the fight for justice doesn't stop here. It's just getting started. If you're ready to continue the fight for justice, subscribe to this channel, where we'll continue to share stories that inspire change, advocate for equality, and help build a better tomorrow. Let's be the change we want to see in the world, together.